Hey guys, today we're going to finish up monetary policy. We're going to learn expansionary or contractionary, and we're going to combine it with an ADAS graph. So we're going to take our money market graph, the graph that shows money supply, money demanded, and interest rates, and combine it with our graph that shows how the economy is doing, ADAS with LRAS either at equilibrium or in an inflationary or recessionary state. So we're going to kind of link the two together. And I'm going to show you the power that the Federal Reserve has to manipulate both graphs. So our I can statement is I can analyze how the Federal Reserve manipulates the money supply through monetary policy. Okay, so they've got two options here, and all of these options have to do with the reserve requirement, the discount rate, or bonds. And they can expand the money supply. And again, the money supply is how much money there is on in bank accounts and in cash in our economy. So how much money is available to citizens, basically. And there's a finite amount at any given time. So when the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, that's expansionary. They're going to create new money, essentially. And they've got three options. They can lower the reserve requirement. And lowering the reserve requirement would mean that banks keep less in their vaults, less in reserves, and loan out more, triggering that money multiplier effect, the magic effect that creates more money. So that would increase the money supply. The Federal Reserve can also lower the discount rate, and that is the rate at which the Fed charges banks to borrow money. So if that rate is lower, then banks charge their customers lower as well, and that would increase the amount of loans, triggering that money multiplier effect, more money created. Or the Federal Reserve can buy bonds. So citizens have bonds that they've invested in. The Federal Reserve can buy those bonds back, giving the citizens money and increasing the amount of money available in the citizenship. Okay? So those are the three options for expansionary. Contractionary is the exact opposite. We're decreasing the money supply, decreasing MS, by increasing the reserve requirement. This would mean banks keep more in their vaults and loan out less, which would lessen that money multiplier effect, lessen the amount of money. We can increase the discount rate, which would be the rate at which the Federal Reserve charges banks to borrow money. So if that discount rate is higher, banks are going to charge their private customers more money. Or we can sell bonds, and selling bonds would be the government issues those treasury bonds. Think like issuing people a piece of paper, even though it's all done online now, and taking citizens' money and out of the money supply, which later on it will be put back into the money supply because of interest rates. And but right now, it would decrease the money supply. Okay? So here's what happens on the graph. When money supply increases, it shifts to the right. Name it MS1, give it an arrow, find that new equilibrium, and that's our new interest rate 1. It looks like interest rates decreased. That means more people are going to take out loans. So increase the amount of loans given out. So the money supply increases, loans are being given out, interest rates are floating down, and this is going to expand our economy. This can be done by lowering the reserve requirement, lowering the discount rate, or buying bonds, just like we went over. Okay? Now here for contractionary, when the money supply decreases, it shifts to the left, give it an arrow, call it a new name. Find that equilibrium, that's our new interest rate. Looks like interest rates increase, so that means there's going to be less loans taken out, okay? And the government does this, the Federal Reserve does this by increasing the reserve requirement, increasing the discount rate, and selling bonds. So let's practice. What would happen here if the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply? So in order to increase the money supply, what can they do? Well, they can do something to the reserve requirement. They can do something to discount rates. They can do something to bonds. So let's figure out what those things are. We can either increase or decrease the reserve requirement. Decreasing the reserve requirement means banks hold on to less money. They loan out more. If they loan out more, there's more available to people. That would increase the money supply. So we're going to decrease the reserve requirement. With the discount rate, the Federal Reserve is charging banks money to borrow money. If they charge more money, they're going to charge their customers more money. If they charge less money, the banks are going to charge their customers less money. And we want more people taking out loans. So we want a lower discount rate. And then when it comes to bonds, the buying and selling of bonds, if the government wants to put more money out into the citizenship, more money out there in the money supply for people to use, then the federal government will buy bonds back from people. Okay, so we've got the 3 ways they can do so. Good job. Now let's graph it. If we increase the money supply, we're going to shift it to the right. So draw a new money supply line, label it MS1, and give it an arrow. Find that new equilibrium. That's where money supply meets money demanded, and that's our interest rate, IR1, and an arrow. Okay? So now we see from this equation, money supply has increased, interest rates have decreased, and if interest rates decrease, that means more people will be taking out loans. So we answered this whole problem. The Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply. We listed the 3 ways, we graphed it, and then we described what happened on the graph. Let's do the opposite. There's only 2 options here. If the federal government wants to decrease the money supply, what are the 3 ways they can do so? Graph it and describe what happens. So it all has to do with the reserve requirement, the discount rate, or bonds. And it's going to be the exact opposite of the last one. I mean, that's pretty simple. So if we want to decrease the money supply, we want more money taken out of circulation, then we want to increase the reserve requirement. So banks have to hold on to more, and they can't loan out as much, creating new money. We want higher interest rates between the Fed and banks, because then banks will charge their customers more and less loans will be taken out. So we want to increase the discount rate. And we want less money out there in the citizenship, in the money supply. We want citizens to have less money. So the Federal Reserve, would sell bonds. They would issue those bonds, take up money, and keep it in the Federal Reserve so it's not available for customers. So let's do this on the graph. So if we're decreasing the money supply, we shift it to the left. We label it MS1 and an arrow. Always do an arrow, new line, new name, and an arrow. Then we find that place where money supply meets money demanded. That's our new equilibrium, and it's called interest rate 1. It looks like it floated upward. Here was our old interest rate. Here's our new. So let's go over here and describe what happened. Money supply decreased. Interest rates increased. And it's not on the graph, but I got to think in my head, if interest rates are more expensive, less people will be taking out loans. And that's how we answer that one. So this is where we're linking the 2 graphs that we've learned this unit together. Literally, they have to do with one another. So the old graph that we learned, remember, is an aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Kind of looks like this. And then there's LRAS down the middle. Okay, so aggregate demand is everything that GDP is made out of, CIGX. And it is the demand for all things in the United States bought and sold in consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. So the government had the power when we learned fiscal policy to manipulate aggregate demand through consumer spending and investment spending. The same thing happens with monetary policy, except now we got 2 graphs and we got to link them together. So when the Federal Reserve takes action to change the money supply, changing the money supply also has an impact on A and D. If we increase MS, that's more money available. That's going to increase consumer spending and increase investment spending. Now, the opposite is also true. If we decrease money supply, that's going to decrease the amount of money people have, which is going to decrease their consumer spending and decrease their investment spending. So that AD curve, if you remember up here, this is the AD curve, it will shift outward if AD increases or inward if AD decreases. So when the money market graph changes, so does the ADAS graph, and we're going to practice that. So if we were to go back to what we just learned, expansionary, contractionary, monetary policy, this graph is going to impact this graph. And it's not complicated. It's stuff that we already know. It's just you got to fit in the right pieces here. It's like putting a puzzle together. So when the economy is in recession, let's take a look at this graph first. When the economy is in recession, here is long-run aggregate supply. That is full output at full employment. That's where we want to be. Y star is our goal. But we are here. We're in recession. We are receding behind our goal. The Fed can choose to use monetary policy to fix that. So in order to fix this issue, they're going to go to this graph and say, well, what can we do? If we increase the money supply, we decrease interest rates. In decreasing interest rates, we're going to increase the number of loans. And that will increase C and increase I. Well, that has to do with this graph. If we increase C and increase I, then people will spend that money on purchases, investing in their businesses, homes, houses, those sort of things. And that's going to increase aggregate demand. And all of a sudden, our equilibrium is where we want it to be. We're at that Y star. full output at full employment. Okay, that was our goal, and we made it there. We just didn't purposefully do this through increasing consumer spending, increasing government spending like taxes, stimulus, or government spending like on the military, like we learned in the first part of the unit. We used money supply to make it to our goal. Okay, the opposite is true of contractionary. When the economy is inflated, so here's where we are, but here's where we want to be. We are above where we want to be, meaning prices are too high. The Fed can use contractionary monetary policy. So reserve requirement, discount rate, bonds, but to contract, we move it inward. That increases our interest rate. Increase interest rate means decrease loans, which means less consumer spending, less investment spending. High interest rates discourage people from borrowing money, discourage you from getting a new car or buying a house or investing in your business. And that was like a roundabout way of decreasing aggregate demand to hit that perfect spot where we are finally at that output at full employment. So prices are not too high. So this graph, what we do on this graph impacts this graph. If we see a problem on this graph, we can use it by manipulating the money supply on this graph. It's confusing, but we're going to go through it, okay? So here's both graphs, and the instructions are very explicit in what they want you to do. So let's go through them. Start by drawing an ADAS graph in an inflationary state using LRAS, okay? So first of all, let me fix this because this is supposed to come down here. Sorry about that, okay? So they want it to be inflationary. So here's where we are, but we have inflated above where we want to be. So that means LRAS is going to be over here. Okay, so there's LRAS, and I'm going to label it as such. I'm going to be zooming in a little bit here just to make it easier for you to see. Okay, so there's where we want to be. That's Y star. That's output at full employment, where prices aren't too high, they're not too low. It's the perfect spot for our economy. So we've done that. Start by drawing. Done. What type of monetary policy should the Fed use on the money market graph? So we are above where we want to be. We don't need to expand. We need to contract. So we're going to contract our economy. Done. When the Fed makes that decision, what happens to money supply, nominal interest rates, consumer, all of this stuff. So first of all, let's talk, how do we contract the economy here? Well, we've got three options when it comes to money supply: reserve requirement, discount rate, and bonds. And we're back to what we already know. So if we want to contract the economy, we increase the reserve requirement. Banks have to keep more. We increase discount rates. That makes private interest loans more expensive. And do we buy or sell bonds? We want less money out there. Less money out there means that the government should sell bonds to people. Okay, issue those statements, issue those treasury securities, and take up money into the Federal Reserve that's not available to citizens. Okay, so there's how we do it. There's the three ways how we do it. Let's actually graph it. So we're contracting the economy. We're shifting it to the left. Oh, I keep forgetting. Here we go. Left. And we call it MS1. Give it an arrow. Find that new equilibrium, and that's IR1, and it looks like interest rates went up. So now when the Fed makes that decision, what happens to the money supply, nominal interest rates, consumer investment spending, AD, inflation, output? Oh my gosh, it's so much, okay? So let's just focus on this graph first. What happened to the money supply? We decreased the money supply. When that happened, what happened to interest rates? It increased interest rates, which isn't on the graph, but we know this. That's going to decrease the amount of loans people take out. Now, that's the portion when we shift over. We've done money supply, we've done nominal interest rates. Now we shift over to this graph. If people are taking out less loans, what's going to happen to consumer and investment spending? Decrease consumer spending, decrease investment spending. And because C and I are portions, they are functions of aggregate demand now goes down too. So let's do that. Let's do that on our graph over here. So we've got aggregate demand right here, and we want to decrease it so that it hits that perfect spot. So let's do that. And this is the spot where we have full employment, and that's our output at full employment. So we decrease that line. We give it a new name, AD1. Give it an arrow from old to new. Find the new equilibrium, and that's price level 1. And our new output, good job, we made it to Y star. Let's from old output to new output, it was a decrease as well. So what happens to money supply? We did that. Good job for us. What happens to nominal interest rates? Done. Consumer investment spending? Done. AD? Done. Now, what happened to inflation? What happened to our price levels? Looks like PL went, oop, and I didn't put my arrow, down. Inflation, that's inflation. Output is our GDP, went down. And unemployment's not on the graph, but I just got to think, using my head, if we're making less stuff, price levels are going down. That means more people are losing their job. Unemployment increased. Well, holy guacamole, that was a big old problem. But guess what? There's only 2 that I could ever possibly give you. So here's the next one. Start by drawing an ADAS graph in an inflationary state using LRAS. That's supposed to say contractionary. Boop, 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 boop. Wait. Recessionary, sorry. Recessionary. Sorry about that. Okay, so first let me draw in my equilibrium because I forgot to do that. Okay, so draw an ADAS graph in recessionary state using LRAS. So here's where we are, but we need to be receding behind where we want to be. So let's draw that in. There's my LRAS. Okay, so here's where we want to be. Here's where we are. We are receding behind that. And we don't want to be in recession. We want to expand to get back up there. So what type of monetary policy should the Fed use? Expansionary. And how do we use expansionary? Let's remember, we've got reserve requirement, discount rate, and bonds that the Federal Reserve can do things to. So if we want to expand the economy, we want more money out there, we decrease the reserve requirement. If we want more money out there, we want more loans, we decrease the discount rate. So it has that pressure on interest rates to float downward. And then do we buy or sell bonds? We want more money out there. So the Federal Reserve is going to buy bonds. So we figured out that portion. What type of monetary policy? When the Fed makes that decision, what happens to money supply? Let's graph it. So we would increase money supply because we're expanding. So shift it to the right. Label it MS1 and an arrow. New line, new name, and an arrow. Find the new equilibrium. Go over from that equilibrium. That's our interest rate. What happened to interest rate? It dropped downward. When the money supply increased, that encouraged more borrowing, encouraged competition between banks, and thus we get lower interest rates, okay? So now let's go describe this graph down here. So what happens to the money supply? Looks like increase money supply, decrease interest rates, and this isn't on the graph, but I just got to know. That means more people are going to take out loans. And all of a sudden, we're shifting over to this other graph, okay? So when more people are taking out loans, what happens to consumer and investment spending? We're going to invest more in houses and cars. We're going to invest more in our business if we're taking out loans. When C and I go up, those are both functions of AD. AD is going to increase as well. So here's where we're finally going to fix this graph. We've got to increase aggregate demand. So we shift it out to the right to hit that perfect spot at full employment. Ooh, sorry about that. Label it AD1, give it an arrow from old to new line, new name, and an arrow. And then find that equilibrium point, go over, and that's our new price level. Price level 1. Looks like it increased. Then go down, and that's our new output level. It's to Y star, that's what we wanted. And from old to new, it looked like it increased as well. So we finished out that graph. Now let's describe the graph. What happened when we increase aggregate demand? Price level increased, our GDP increased, and this isn't on the graph, but I just got to know if we're making more stuff, or our GDP, the count of all goods and services made and sold in the United States, goes up. That means less people are losing their jobs. We are employing more people. So unemployment goes down. And that's it, okay? So you just got to think, I manipulate this graph, and the things I do on this graph, because people are going to be taking out more loans, come over and impact this graph. And that's a way that the government, an option the government has to fix the economy if something's wrong. All right, thank you so much.